I'm going to show you guys 3 things that I use on every single mix to help vocals sit in the song, but will also have a presence and an upfront sound where you kind of get to have your cake and eat it too. One of the 3 things I see people do often, but the other 2 I never see anywhere on YouTube, anywhere on TikTok. And I picked up all of these tricks looking over the shoulders of some of the best mixing engineers in the world. So let's get started. We're going to be focusing on these 4 faders specifically. This one's not really doing anything. And let me take my reverbs off. My solar-powered keyboard is mad because it doesn't have any power, because it sits under a desk all day. Mistakes were made. First thing, and the most popular thing, and the thing that I have seen before, we're going to put some parallel saturation on there. Quick note about parallel saturation. Parallel saturation is a form of parallel compression. Saturation in general is a form of compression, and it's essentially an analog piece of equipment that's approaching total harmonic distortion. You're passing the 0 point on that particular, processor, and it's inviting harmonic details and harmonic quality into it. So it's important to know that saturating in parallel is like compressing in parallel, but with more interesting harmonic information. When it comes to the decapitator, I'm almost always using the tone somewhere between this part of dark and that part of bright on a vocal. If it's a very bright vocal, you'll hear me bring a lot more dark in. If it's a very dark vocal, I'll turn the brightness up a lot, but this is generally my starting point. I gain stage my sessions the same way every time, so I know that drive 4 on the EMI is going to give me a predictable result based on my experience, and this is why gain staging to me is so important. I'm already able to pick up right at the sweet spot without having to fuck around at all, because I always gain stage all of my tracks to live an average around -18. Super, super time saving. It takes a little bit more setup on the front end, but as you go from mix to mix and mix to mix, it allows you to notice patterns and consistencies in your workflow that lets you kind of skip certain steps. It doesn't mean that I'll never adjust that drive. It doesn't mean that I'll never adjust these things. It just means that I'm starting from a point that's consistent from mix to mix, right? I didn't turn up the drive in this case. I almost always use the EMI for vocals. I think that it just adds a lot of top-end harmonics that are very pleasing to my ears, right? So let's hear what this sounds like real quick. Let's hear what this is doing.
Under the lights we lie now. Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. This is not freedom. This is us hiding from them.
Now you can have varying degrees of aggression with this. The more aggressive you are with it, the more your dynamic range is compromised, but then sometimes the fatter the sound is, right? So what you're accomplishing when you're doing this kind of thing, and let me look where my hands are here, is like the LA2A is clamping down on things getting too out of hand in the sort of loudness direction, right? But what parallel saturation does is it takes the subtlety and the detail of the sound, almost brings the quiet parts up, right? And this is the difference between downward compression and upward compression. When you're downward compressing, you're doing what like a LA2A is doing, where you're keeping the peaks from getting too out of hand. What upward compression is doing, or parallel saturation, parallel compression, all of these are different forms of upward compression, is you're bringing the subtleties, the details, the quieter parts louder, right? So what you're having when you combine these two things is sort of a squeezing effect where the detail is getting louder, and by saturating it, you're adding harmonics to that detail and making it more exciting. And then the LA2A is just taming those peaks, smoothing out that vocal a little bit, and the release profile of it works very well for this kind of thing. So this is what you're accomplishing with this combination of things, right? And it goes back to, you want to mix vocals like you're using a paintbrush and not like you're using a chisel. The human ear is extremely sensitive to changes in voice that are unnatural and that are unusual, and things will sound more and more inhuman the more aggressively you treat them. By doing gentle brushstrokes with a lot of different effects, it all combines into one thing that's like larger than the sum of its parts, but isn't making your vocal sound inhuman or distant from the original. I share Manny Marroquin's view where less is more with vocals. Like, let the real sound, the authenticity of that voice and of that singer be on full display, when it's good. Obviously, some voices need to be produced more than others, but I like the tonal quality of her voice already. I'm not trying to step on anything. I'm not trying to carve things out of it. I just want to make it the most beautiful representation of itself that it can be. That's a mentality that I picked up from chatting with Manny Marroquin a couple times. Now that we've got step one out of the way, let's go into the second thing that I put on every single vocal to make it sit, but also make it pop. So this is an EMT 250. This is a plate reverb. And you'll notice that my settings, 20 millisecond attack time, 0.4 reverb time. So a very quick pre-delay and a very quick reverb time. These two settings here, this is how this loads in default. And I generally don't fuck with it. So let's listen to what that's doing here.
Ain't been breathing for many years now. In the dirt and light.
So you can hear how that sounds, a very, very tight room. And there's a certain point where you bring it up and it really just makes her voice sound really full without making you sit there and say, oh wow, there's a reverb on that. So I like to fade this up until I can hear, okay, that's audibly a reverb, and then dial it back until I can feel it, but I can't necessarily hear it. Where if it's gone, I miss it. But if it's there, I'm not really entirely sure what's making it sound that way.
Ain't been breathing for many years now.
That to me is very obvious, right?
In the dirt and lies, we lie now. Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. This is not freedom. This is
subtle, very subtle. But you can tell when I mute it, it loses energy. But there's nothing that's extremely defining about the energy that it adds when it's there. And this is the target we're looking for, right? So that's the second thing. Very simple. This is not your main vocal reverb. This is something that you just kind of set as a similar parallel process to your saturation that just gives the voice more volume in a way that's like, it's got width, it's got spread, it's got juice and interesting things going on, but it's like almost indiscernible. And then very similar to this, the third thing we're gonna add is we're gonna add a slapback delay. So the way that you want to calibrate this is you want to set this to 80 milliseconds or as close as you can. This one only goes as fast as 92.88, right? Unless I change stuff, but it's not important. A little bit of feedback. You don't want one slap, but you don't want it to get phasey because it's going to be quick. And what we want to do here is we want to bring this delay up till it's like way too loud.
Ain't been breathing.
And then once that's there, you want to just start opening up that delay time. Unless it sounds perfect already, just start opening up that delay time until you just feel some magic. There's no perfect setting. You don't want to divide your BPM by however many seconds and find what's perfect in time. Fuck all that shit. That's bad practice in my opinion. You want to hear and feel these things out to where they sound satisfying. Because sometimes the delay being a little early is better than it being perfectly on time, and sometimes being a little late is better than being perfectly on time. So I'm not a big fan of the whole divide everything by this much to find what a quarter note is and all that. Like, it's a cool starting point if you need a quarter note delay, but for something like this is more about feel and energy and excitement than it is about rigidity, I guess. So we're gonna play this and we're gonna turn that delay time up slowly until it's just sitting in a point where you feel something, right?
Ain't been breathing for many years now. In the dirt and lies, we lie now. Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. This is not freedom. This is us hiding from them. Leave it alone, and it will be clear. With our heads It's underwater we feel.
So I'm liking where that's sitting. 110 was okay, 130 was okay, but I found that there was a pocket that slapback sat in very nicely when you're more sort of 120, 124. And it just makes me feel satisfied with the voice. It's just, we're going purely off of feel right here. It's instincts, it's real mixing. You're trying to make the audience feel something, so you better fucking feel something too, instead of just doing math. And then we do the same thing that we did with that reverb. We're gonna turn that up until it's like definitely a slapback, and then just dial it back until the energy is there, and it's very, very subtle. But when you add all of these three layers together and then take them away, you're gonna hear the richness and the fullness just go away and then come back.
Ain't been breathing for many years now. Under dirt and lies we lie now. Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them.
And I can just barely hear that slapback in the background. And it's not unusual for the reverb and the delay to kind of sit at the same gain level, especially if you're like me, drilling at your fucking brain, you gain stage. Because when you gain stage, things become consistent because you're using consistent levels. So let's go back to our vocal just by itself, right?
Ain't been breathing for many years now.
And now let's add those in.
Under dirt and lies we lie now. Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. This is not freedom, this is us hiding from them.
And in case you think the saturation's doing all the work, this is it without the saturation, and I'll add that in.
Ain't been breathing for many years now. Under dirt and lies we lie now.
Like, you can hear the fullness of that voice just wake up when I add those three tracks, and the nature of this is even more drastic in the context of a song with all of the other stuff playing behind it. Note as well that if you don't use pre-fade sends, this becomes proportional. So you can automate that saturation in the chorus or whatever to bring a little bit of punch and bring a little bit more energy out of the voice. But generally speaking, you can treat this vocal fader as the vocal level, and everything else will sort of accommodate it because it's all proportional to how loud that voice is. You may say, oh, well, it'll distort more if you turn the voice up louder than when you calibrated it. Yeah, it will, but I don't really think that's a bad thing. I think that's kind of the point. If you're going to juice the vocal up, you want the parallel saturation to juice up with it, right? So let's listen to this with the track behind it. And I'm going to have to level these vocals because I don't know where the fuck they are in this whole thing.
Been breathing for many years now. Under dirt and lies we lie now. Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them.
Now listen to that when I take those layers out and then put them back in, and you'll hear the difference.
Ain't been breathing for many years now.
Check this out.
Under dirt and lies we lie now.
It's a huge difference. It might not sound extremely drastic, but it shouldn't sound extremely drastic. It just sounds like everything just got bigger, better, richer, stronger. And that's the whole point. You're taking a lot of these small things and you're putting them together and making them greater than the sum of their parts. Now, listen to what happens when you start bringing in all your reverbs as well. This is gonna sing.
Ain't been breathing for many years now. Under dirt and lies
Bit more top.
we lie
in case y'all are interested, let me show you what I did with that Filter Freak. All being sent through all these layers as well. It's all the sum of its parts, right?
I've been breathing for many years now, under dirty lies we lie now. Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. This is not freedom, this is us hiding from them.
And then listen to this transition.
Leave it alone, and it will be.
Nothing will make an audience go crazy like contrast. The contrast here was great. I couldn't resist that effect. Now let's mute all these again and let's play it with all the reverbs and spatial effects happening. I'll take the Filter Freak off since that's kind of not part of the point here. And now listen to the back, and then I'm gonna bring these back in, and you're gonna hear that difference again. And then I'll explain why this works.
I've been breathing
It's just a little dull, right?
under dirty lies we lie now.
Crazy.
Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. This is not freedom, this is us hiding from them.
Let me explain to you why this works, right? So the reason we like slapback delays, the reason to a certain extent we like reverbs, although this is a slightly different dynamic, is that it smears things over short periods of time, right? So you're hearing different copies of that voice spread across what in our minds is like the blink of an eye. It's something momentary. I mean, we're talking 20 millisecond pre-delay on the reverb, 0.4 seconds of a reverb tail, which in essence, you're probably only hearing like 0.2 seconds of it. So it's 200 milliseconds at that time. The slapback delay is 120 milliseconds. So like you're hearing these very, very short bursts of the same copy of the signal or copies of the signal that have been slightly altered. And your brain processes them as one signal, so it brings things all into like one thing. So you taking up the sonic real estate of like a lot of very small parts from inside the box standpoint, like how much space do you have to work with, how much stereo energy do you have to work with, how much room in your mix bus compressor you have to work with, and you're tricking the brain into feeling like things are louder than they are by introducing many different copies of the same signal in a lot of subtle different ways. And that's how your brain processes that. So much of these mixing techniques and these mixing tricks are literally just tricking your brain into thinking it's hearing something that it's actually hearing something else. And the deeper you can dive into the psychology of how these things work, the more advantageous and the more you can use these things to your benefit. This tight reverb effect is actually used on electric guitars a lot as well, especially in like the metal genre, to get that really punchy, really big, larger than life guitar sound. A short spring, a short verb can do wonders at doing that, as well as any bigger reverbs you may want, not instead of. Think of it almost like its own form of parallel saturation, because it kind of is. I have these three processors on every single vocal, on every single lead vocal of every single mix that I do. And the bonus that you get is that it creates a degree of separation between your lead vocal and all of your backups. There's an otherworldly depth, width, size, mass, fullness to the lead vocal that helps it stand out in contrast, again, big word, contrast, to all of the other vocals that are happening in the song. Bonus. I'm gonna give you a bonus thing you can add as well. And this I only do sometimes, and it really just depends on the type of song. I didn't put it on this song, which I'm actually kind of surprised that I didn't, but let's fuck with this anyway. So what we're gonna do here is we're just gonna put a little chorusing on here. This is a little bit more popular of an effect. I don't think this is much of a secret, but it can really take things to the next level, right? A good way to look at this is something, a je ne sais quoi you can add in like the chorus or when there's another part pickup or like a modulation. It's similar to what I did with that, like with that Filter Freak, just adding interest, adding detail, adding change, keeping people interested in what's happening. So I like to turn this up and then choose, this is my preferred chorusing plugin, and just choose which one of these modes sounds the best for this voice.
Ain't been breathing for many years now, and the dirty lies we lie now.
I'm liking how one sounds. It's a little bit narrower than the other ones, which some people might find unattractive, but I think it adds a lot to what's already there, and getting a lot of width out of that reverb and out of that delay already for, you know, lead vocal, which really should be front and center. So again, we're just going to blend that in a way that's like almost indistinguishable. And then anytime you need to just bring a little bit of extra something in there, you can push it a little bit more. There's room to push everything here, and that's key because things don't stay still in mixing. You're going to want to bring that vocal up sometimes. You might want to bring it down sometimes, and you need everything else to play well with it.
Ain't been breathing for many years now, and the dirty lies we lie now.
Something you can do with this choruser, and I'm going to break my own rules here and just use this fucking stock ass EQ right here with pretty pictures on it, is you can shelf out some of that low end. Let's just say like -6 and it's about 250. So you're getting rid of some of that fun. Like the danger of chorusing is that it can make your foundational frequencies sound weird. Like it's if you, like, let's say you're going to put a chorus on a bass, like you wouldn't really want it to be like on anything below 120 hertz because it's just going to like bastardize the fundamental frequency of things. But you want it to blend into like the mid-range and the top end, right? So 250 might be a little more aggressive than we need. I think we can just go like 180. So we're getting a little bit in that 180, but it's pretty much 3 dB of reduction. And then similarly, you can take a nice shelf and get a little bit more of that air in there. This is a super popular thing to do where you get those like really buttery, really intense vocals. Like you can push the top end harder when it's moving, when you have phasing going on, flanging going on, chorusing going on, any of those kinds of things. It's a lot easier to push the top end without it getting harsh because the frequencies that are exciting are moving. They're not staying still. They're not building up in your head, right?
Ain't been breathing for many years now,
So listen to that pop up.
and the dirty lies we lie now.
You hear that little airiness that came in when I brought that EQ in? That's what that is. That's the top end, the extreme top end, just moving, just phasing, just doing some cool stuff. And that's where you get that buttery pop sound where it's like, how do they get all this treble in here without it destroying my ears? Like part of it is really good equipment. Like the more expensive microphones generally improve the top end sound more than they improve anything else. And the second thing is just when you're boosting that top end, you're moving it around, you're affecting it, you're chorusing it, you're not letting it lock in into like one harsh kind of area. And it's also easier to do when you treat your vocals better on the front end. Mixing tip 2. As you're doing this or making changes to anything, like once I got my vocal chain on there and I like how my EQs are going to go, I'm going to pull that fader down again and re-level that vocal and constantly keep like every time you go and you make an EQ tweak or you make an EQ change or you treat something, drag that fader right back down to -infinity and reset its position. Because every time you add processing, even if you're gain staging the input and the output, you're changing the profile and the information of that sound and how it interacts with the rest of your song. So it's so important to keep resetting the fader positions, these things, and why having touch like faders and the ability to just touch them and move them around is so fucking huge, is that you have this ability to just keep managing things and resetting things and making sure everything's in the right place. So now that I have all these different effects in here, I'm just bringing that vocal fader down to 0, just finding that sweet spot there.
Been breathing for many years now, and the dirty lies we lie now. Unpleasant surprises, it hides a host of them. This is not
started with my vocal at like 9 dB, and now that I have all these little layers in here, it's like -12. The sweet spot changes with every change you make, and it's important to keep resetting that position, or else things just start getting out of hand. Understanding these little tricks will absolutely change the game for you in your mixing. So if this helped, drop a like, drop a comment, let me know what else you want to learn, what else you want to know. I'll share with you everything that I've learned in mixing. When you've been doing this for 10, 12, 13 years like I have, it's hard to remember exactly all, like, you learn that everybody struggles with different things. So it's easy, like, if you let me know what you want to learn, I'm happy to share with you all the little tidbits I've picked up hanging out in studios, watching over the shoulder of some of the greatest mixers, having conversations with them about the things that they do. I'm here for you guys. Just let me know what you need to know. I'll show you what you need to know.